Hi, Kappy. First of all, thanks for agreeing to participate in this video. In some of your recent research, you've described photography already in the 19th century as what you call a composite object. Could you first explain a bit what you mean by this term, and then talk a bit about what resources were required for photography in the 19th century, and where these resources were sourced from?
While photographic papers may seem like fairly simple or humble commodities, in fact, their production during the 19th century was a fairly complex, multi-step process that involved many different materials and people working and moving across distances. The first step in this process was the creation of high-quality rag papers. And for most of the 19th century, the vast majority of the rag papers produced for photographic use came from just two specialized mills. One of these mills was located in Rive, France, and the other in Malmedy, Prussia, which is now a part of Belgium. And the reason that these two mills dominated the industry was because they were located near water sources that had very low mineral content. And this was important because if extraneous minerals were introduced into the photographic papers, that could interfere with the photochemical process and introduce defects in finished prints, which of course photographers wanted to avoid. So the papers that were made at these mills were created by highly skilled paper makers and were composed of two main fibers, flax and cotton. According to one study, flax accounted for about 85% of the fiber content of these papers and cotton for about 15%. So the next question we need to ask ourselves is, where did this flax and cotton likely come from during the 19th century? In the case of flax, cultivation was concentrated in Ireland as well as Scotland, Germany, and Russia. And for the most part, it was grown by fairly small-scale family farmers. Cotton cultivation, on the other hand, was dominated by the United States, in large part because plantations in the American South, at least before the Civil War, depended on the forced labor of enslaved men, women, and children. And then following the Civil War, on the exploitative sharecropping system. So these finished rag papers would be sent from these mills then on to specialized factories where they would be coated with a binder for photographic use. And the two most common binders during the 19th century were egg white for the creation of albumin papers, and then gelatin for the creation of certain aristotype papers, as well as, of course, early silver gelatin papers. And binders played a very important role in 19th and also 20th century photographic papers because this was the layer of the paper where light-sensitive materials such as silver would be suspended. So these binders were usually created and also applied to the rag papers by working class women who lived typically in big cities like Dresden, which was one of the capitals, one of the centers for the production of photographic papers during the 19th century. And I think it's also important to acknowledge here the really important role of animals in the creation of these binders. Chickens, for example, laid millions upon millions of eggs that were required for the production of the egg white binder for albumin papers. And gelatin for certain aristotype and silver gelatin papers was produced primarily from the bones and hides of cows and pigs, which I realize is not a pleasant thought, but it's really important, I think, to acknowledge that this is the source of this absolutely central photographic material. So after the binder had been applied to the rag papers, they would then be dried, finished, and then packaged and sent out to various photographic emporia around the world where photographers would purchase them to make prints. So, as I hope this brief outline has shown, the production of photographic papers was very much a global endeavor, and one that required a huge amount of labor from individuals from many different social groups.
What can tracing the origins of photographic paper in the 19th century tell us about the history and development of this medium?
One of the first things I realized when I started researching the history and production of photographic papers was that global trade was absolutely essential to the emergence and flourishing of photography. Truly, it would not be the mass medium that we know today without these international trade networks. Second, doing this research led me to rethink in important ways the labor involved in the production of photographs. Typically, art historians tend to focus on and privilege the labor of individual photographers, who, during the 19th century at least, were overwhelmingly white and male. However, when we turn to look at material networks and the production of photographic goods, we can begin to see and appreciate the central role played by those who are often marginalized in mainstream histories of photography, namely women, the enslaved, the working class, and even animals.
Can you talk a bit about the rise of Kodak and other mega corporations at the end of the 19th century and how that affected the development of photographic paper at the time?
The rise of the Eastman Kodak Company had a significant impact on the production and circulation of photographic papers during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Though best known as manufacturers of cameras, Kodak also produced a wide range of photographic papers. And to gain an advantage in the market for this essential commodity, Kodak worked out a deal with the two paper mills that produced the raw paper stock for photographic papers as a means to control its import into the United States. Through this and other crafty maneuvers, Kodak gained considerable control over the American market for photographic papers and even made inroads into the European market. What's really interesting about this situation, though, is even as American companies emerged as leaders in the supply of photographic goods during the late 19th century, they continued to depend on European products and transatlantic trade.
And lastly, what can we learn about the relationship between photography and climate change by tracing the history or the material history of photographic paper?
The production of photographic papers during the 19th and 20th centuries had many harmful effects on the environment. To give just one example, many different chemicals were required to break down the cotton and linen rags used in the production of photographic papers. Due to a general lack of regulations, many of these chemicals were then dumped back into waterways, where they polluted water and soil near paper mills. In the United States, many sites where photographic papers were produced have now been classified as Superfund sites. These are places that the Environmental Protection Agency has flagged as being contaminated by hazardous waste and that require extensive and expensive cleanup efforts. These include sites owned by the Eastman Kodak Company, as well as the Napera Chemical Company in New York State, which produced the very popular Velox paper.
Also das ist eine Fotografie auf Albuminpapier, also in der Zeit um 1880 ungefähr entstanden. Und das Albuminpapier ist so das erste, wenn man so will, industriell produzierte Kopierpapier für Fotografen. Und es ist ein zweischichtiges Papier, das heißt, auf dem eigentlichen Papierträger sitzt eine Schicht aus Eiweiß. Albumin ist eben aus Hühnereiweiß gemacht und in diesem Eiweiß ist eigentlich das Silberbild eingebettet. Und das Papier ist verhältnismäßig dünn, deswegen kaschiert man das meist auch auf so einen Karton hier auf, weil es die Tendenz hat, sich sonst einzurollen. Und weil diese Schicht eben so dünn ist, kann man mit so einer Standlupe in 30-facher Vergrößerung die Papierfaser, also auch von der Vorderseite aus, noch erkennen. also durch diese Albuminschicht hindurch. Das ist eine Besonderheit von dem Papier in der Zeit. Spätere Papiere eben einen Schichtaufbau haben, wo, ich sage jetzt mal, die Bildschicht die Papierschicht so verdeckt, dass man die Papierfaser in dieser Vergrößerung nicht mehr sieht oder überhaupt nicht mehr sieht von der Vorderseite aus. Die Rückseite ist halt meistens für uns unzugänglich durch diese Kaschierung.